There is a stretch of land that begins where the Atlantic breathes cold fog over fishing villages and ends where the Pacific presses against walls of ancient cedar. Between those two coasts lies the second largest country on Earth, a place most of the world associates with vast wilderness, quiet towns, and a national story that began in the common imagination only a few centuries ago. But beneath that modern story, buried under glacial till and lake sediment and centuries of uninterrupted forest growth, lies another history entirely. It does not fit neatly into the accepted timelines taught in schools. It surfaces in the form of carved stones found in geological layers that predate every civilization we thought we knew. In submerged structures resting on lake floors no survey was supposed to find. In Norse artifacts recovered hundreds of miles from any documented Norse settlement. In ceremonial alignments built with a precision no culture in the accepted record was supposed to possess. Canada holds more unexplained ancient discoveries than almost any other landmass on Earth, and most of them remain hidden in plain sight, documented and measured, and then quietly set aside. This is a journey through those discoveries, told slowly, without interruption, for the hours when the mind wants something to rest against. What you're about to hear is real. Every site, every artifact, every measurement described in this video has been documented by archaeologists, geologists, and historians. The explanations remain open. The mysteries remain alive. Settle in. If this kind of content helps you sleep or wind down, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Long-form sleep documentaries go out regularly on this channel. For extended, uninterrupted versions and early access to new topics, the Patreon link is in the description below. Now, with the light low and no particular place to be, let us begin. On the northern shore of Manitoulin Island, where Lake Huron spreads wide and gray toward the horizon, there is a site so old and so inconvenient to the accepted story of human arrival in the Americas that the archaeologist who discovered it was effectively removed from his position, and his findings were boxed up and kept away from serious scrutiny for decades. The site is called Shegianda, and what was recovered from its deepest layers has the potential to rewrite not just Canadian history, but the entire understood timeline of human presence in the Western Hemisphere. Manitoulin Island is the largest freshwater island in the world. It sits in the northern part of Lake Huron, connected to the Canadian mainland by a single swing bridge and surrounded by water that stays cold even in the height of summer. The landscape is ancient in the way that only places shaped by ice can truly be. The bedrock here is Precambrian, among the oldest exposed stone on the planet, and the land carries the unmistakable marks of glacial movement. Rounded hillocks, scratched stone surfaces, shallow depressions that fill with reeds and silence. Standing on the shoreline of Shegianda on a still autumn morning, with the lake gray and flat and the sky pressing low, it is impossible not to feel the weight of deep time pressing back. Thomas E. Lee arrived at the site in 1951 as an archaeologist working for the National Museum of Canada. He was experienced, methodical, and not particularly given to dramatic claims. He had been drawn to the location by surface lithic scatter, the kind of scattered stone tool, fragments that indicate long-term human habitation. What he found in the upper layers of excavation matched expectations, evidence of indigenous occupation spanning several thousand years, fire pits, tools, the ordinary archaeology of a long-inhabited island shore. But as his team dug deeper, the situation became anything but ordinary. Below the familiar cultural layers, the team encountered stone artifacts in positions that geologically made very little sense under the accepted model of North American peopling. The tools, fashioned from local quartzite, appeared in deposits of glacial, till, and boulder clay that geologists associated with the final retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. That retreat ended somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 years ago in this region, depending on the specific horizon and location being measured. But some of the tool-bearing sediments appeared to predate even that event, resting in layers that had been laid down during active glaciation rather than after it. The geological implications were staggering. If the tools were where the geology said they were, people had been using this rocky promontory while the ice was still moving across the land. Lee reported his findings carefully and submitted his data to the National Museum. He published preliminary accounts in academic literature. The response from the archaeological establishment was not engagement. It was silence, and then something more active than silence. Lee found his research funding cut. He found himself transferred away from the museum's direct involvement in Canadian field archaeology. The excavation at Shegianda was, as Lee would later describe it, deliberately suppressed. His notes were preserved but not promoted. The site was not subjected to the kind of rigorous, interdisciplinary follow-up that a discovery of this magnitude would normally attract. Lee spent years afterward documenting what he believed had happened, writing in small publications and newsletters about the institutional resistance he encountered. He described conversations with colleagues who privately agreed with his geological assessments, but who refused to say so publicly. He described a scientific culture in which the then dominant theory of North American peopling, the Clovis first model that held humans had not arrived in the hemisphere before roughly 13,000 years ago, was so deeply entrenched that contradictory evidence was not disputed but suppressed. Lee died in 1982, largely outside the mainstream of Canadian archaeology. The Shegianda site was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1978, which represented some form of official acknowledgement that something significant had taken place there. But the deeper questions Lee raised were never formally resolved. The geological dating of the deepest tool-bearing layers was never subjected to the kind of comprehensive, multi-institutional review that might have settled the matter. What makes the Shegianda case especially significant in the broader context of Canadian prehistory is not only the age implied by the geological context, but the nature of the tools themselves. The quartzite implements recovered from the deeper layers are not the refined pressure-flaked projectile points associated with Clovis technology. They are simpler, heavier, and in some respects more similar to the lithic technology found at pre-Clovis sites in South America and in Siberian Upper Paleolithic assemblages. Researchers who take the site seriously have argued this is not the toolkit of a population arriving at the tail end of the Ice Age. It is the toolkit of people who were here much earlier, people who may have been using this rocky promontory for reasons we can only now guess at from a distance of many thousands of years. The island itself may hold additional clues. Manitoulin is a sacred place in the traditions of the Anishinaabe people, who have maintained continuous cultural presence in the region for as long as their oral histories extend. The island's name derives from an Anishinaabe word meaning spirit island, and it figures in creation, narratives, and medicine traditions as a place of particular power. Whether those traditions encode a memory of the very deep human occupation that Lee's tools hint at is impossible to say with certainty. But oral traditions have, in other contexts around the world, proven to be far older and far more accurate than researchers once assumed. The possibility that Manitoulin's sacred status reflects a human relationship with this place, going back not hundreds but tens of thousands of years, should not be dismissed without investigation. The broader archaeological context lends support to the general principle, if not the specific extreme dates, of what Lee was arguing. Since his work at Shegianda, a growing body of evidence from across the Americas has demonstrated that humans arrived in the Western Hemisphere well before the 13,000-year threshold. The Clovis, first model once held as an absolute ceiling. The Monte Verde site in Chile, accepted by the mainstream archaeological community in the late 1990s, placed human occupation in South America at least 14,500 years ago. Bluefish caves in the Yukon have yielded evidence of human presence approaching 24,000 years ago. The Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho has produced dates exceeding 16,000 years. The Clovis first model is no longer the default assumption even within mainstream archaeology, which means Thomas Lee's findings at Shigenda deserve a second look. Not a dismissive second look, not a look clouded by the institutional pressures that shaped the original response, but a careful, open, and multidisciplinary examination of what those tools found in glacial till truly represent. That examination has not yet happened. The tools sit in museum storage, wrapped in archival tissue, and cataloged with numbers that give no indication of what they might mean. The site sits on its island above the cold gray lake, its rocky promontory unchanged since the day Lee's team packed their equipment and left. The Anishinaabe continue their relationship with the island in their own way, on their own terms, maintaining traditions that reach back further than any scientific date yet proposed for the Shigenda site. And the questions Lee spent his career trying to answer remain, for now, unanswered. Not because the evidence was insufficient, and not because the question was unimportant, but because the moment for serious investigation has not yet arrived. It will arrive, eventually. The evidence will still be there when it does. Several hours east of Shigenda, in the Canadian Shield Country, north of Peterborough, Ontario, a limestone outcrop holds the largest concentration of pre-contact Indigenous rock carvings in Canada. The site is known formally as the Peterborough Petroglyphs, and within the Anishinaabe tradition it carries the name Kino-Magewap-Kong, which translates roughly as the rocks that teach. More than 900 individual images are incised into the pale crystalline marble of the outcrop, carved by people who worked in this place with stone tools over a period that researchers estimate spans from roughly 1,000 to 5,000 years ago. The carvings include animals, humans, boats, celestial symbols, and forms that do not correspond neatly to any known category. A number of the images have been interpreted as shamanic vision figures, spirit helpers, or cosmological maps. Several have attracted a different kind of attention altogether from a small but persistent group of researchers who see in them something that predates even the sophisticated traditions of the Eastern woodland peoples. The site is situated in a region of the Canadian Shield where the geology is deeply old and the landscape still carries the hummocky, lake-scattered character left by retreating ice. The limestone outcrop on which the carvings appear sits in a shallow depression in the forest, and its surface, polished and pale, gives the images a ghostly visibility in certain qualities of light. The petroglyphs were first formally documented by Western researchers in the early 20th century, though local indigenous communities had maintained awareness of and relationship with the site throughout the colonial period and before. Most of the images at the Peterborough site are interpreted within the framework of Algonquian spiritual and cosmological traditions, and this interpretation is well supported and widely accepted among scholars working in the field of indigenous rock art. The carvings depict beings associated with the Anishinaabe cosmos, the underwater panther known as Mishibiji, the thunderbird, human figures in ceremonial postures, and a range of abstract markings associated with altered states of consciousness and spiritual contact. The site was almost certainly a place of ceremony and vision, a location where contact with non-ordinary reality was sought and recorded in permanent stone. Cracks in the limestone run beneath certain image groups and carry the sound of water moving deep below, an underground stream that Anishinaabe traditions associate with the spirit world beneath the surface of ordinary existence. On quiet mornings, when there are no other visitors and the light comes in at a low angle, you can hear that water if you press close to the stone. It sounds like something moving with intention through the dark below. But among the 900 or more images, a smaller group of carvings has attracted a different kind of attention. In the 1970s, a researcher named Barry Fell, a marine biologist at Harvard who had developed an avocation for ancient scripts, examined photographs of the Peterborough petroglyphs and identified within them what he claimed were inscriptions in Ogham, the linear notch-based script associated with early Celtic peoples, as well as characters he attributed to Phoenician, Minoan, and Egyptian writing systems. Fell argued that the site represented evidence of pre-Columbian contact between Old World cultures and the inhabitants of North America, and he published his analysis in a book that generated considerable popular interest and equally considerable academic skepticism. The academic response to Fell's work was largely dismissive, and in many respects, that dismissal was warranted. Fell had a tendency toward overreach, and his linguistic analyses were often imprecise, conflating different script traditions and seeing familiar letter shapes in what were more parsimoniously explained as natural erosion features, or deliberate stylistic marks within indigenous visual conventions. The mainstream scholarly consensus remains that the Peterborough petroglyphs are indigenous in origin and should be interpreted within indigenous cultural frameworks, a position that has the support of both the archaeological evidence and the communities whose ancestors created the site. And yet the dismissal of Fell's broader suggestion has not been entirely absolute. A number of researchers working independently have noted that certain figures at the site, particularly a group of images depicting what appear to be long-hulled boats with high prows and low gunnels, look more like the vessel types of Bronze Age Mediterranean cultures than like the watercraft associated with eastern woodland indigenous peoples. One figure in particular, a large carving sometimes called the Horned God figure, has been compared to Bronze Age European representations of deities in ways that are, at minimum, intriguing to those who look at them with fresh eyes. The question of what these images mean and who made them is complicated by the layered nature of the site itself. The Peterborough outcrop was not used in a single period but returned to repeatedly over a very long span of time. Different images may have been made by different peoples at different points across that span. The possibility that some carvings represent a genuinely ancient indigenous tradition, while others represent later additions by visitors from elsewhere, cannot be ruled out on structural grounds alone. It is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a possibility that the site's complexity makes worth holding open. What is not in any dispute is the extraordinary quality of the site as a whole. Looking down at 900 images carved by human hands over millennia, the feeling is of being at a threshold. Something was happening here, repeatedly, across a very long time, that mattered enough to people that they returned again and again to mark it in permanent stone. Whatever interpretation one brings to the specific images, that fundamental fact carries its own weight. This place was important. These images were important, and the full meaning of what was recorded here has not yet been recovered. Move west across the Shield country and the mixed forests of central Ontario, through the flat agricultural grid of the prairies, and eventually the land opens into the short grass country of southern Alberta and Saskatchewan, where the sky is so large it becomes a physical presence of its own. In this landscape, flat and wind-scoured and treeless for hundreds of miles in every direction, ancient peoples built structures on the ground that can only be fully comprehended from above. They are called medicine wheels, and Canada has more of them than anywhere else on Earth. More than 70 have been documented in the Canadian prairies, with additional examples in the adjacent American states. Their age, their function, and the precise nature of the knowledge encoded in them remain subjects of active research and continuing intellectual debate. The most studied of the Canadian medicine wheels is the Majorville Cairn and Medicine Wheel in southern Alberta, located on a low rise overlooking the Bow River Valley. The structure consists of a central cairn of stones, roughly 9 meters in diameter, from which radiate outward 28 stone lines like the spokes of a wheel, extending to an outer ring approximately 90 meters across. Radiocarbon dating of materials from beneath the central cairn has produced dates going back more than 5,000 years, making the Majorville Wheel one of the oldest stone monuments in North America, older than Stonehenge in its final form, and contemporaneous with the earliest phases of the Egyptian pyramid building period. 5,000 years is a number that deserves to be held in the quiet of the evening for a moment. When the foundation stones of the Majorville Cairn were being laid, no pyramid had yet risen from the sands at Giza. The written records of the earliest known civilizations in Mesopotamia were just beginning to be scratched onto clay tablets. In Britain, the standing stone traditions of the Neolithic were in full development, and on a windswept rise above a river in what is now southern Alberta, people were arranging stones in a wheel pattern so precise that its alignments with the sunrise on the summer solstice and with the position of specific stars at specific times of year have been confirmed by multiple independent astronomical analyses. The astronomical significance of the medicine wheels was first seriously investigated in the 1970s by an astronomer who approached the Bighorn medicine wheel in Wyoming, using the same methods that had been applied to Stonehenge. He found that the spokes of the wheel aligned with the rising of the sun on the summer solstice and with the heliacal rising of several bright stars, including Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius. The alignments were too precise and too numerous to be accidental. Later researchers applied the same analytical methods to Canadian wheels, including Majorville and the Moose Mountain Wheel in Saskatchewan, and found similar astronomical orientations encoded in the placement and direction of the spokes. The Moose Mountain Medicine Wheel sits on a long ridge in the Cypress Hills region of Saskatchewan, rising from the surrounding plain in a way that makes it visible from a considerable distance in clear weather. The wheel is roughly 200 meters across, making it one of the largest in Canada, and its central cairn sits at the hub of a system of spokes that extend out to subsidiary cairns at the wheel's perimeter. The astronomical analysis of Moose Mountain revealed alignments with the summer solstice sunrise that are accurate to within 1 degree. The heliacal risings of Aldebaran and Fomalhaut, both significant stars in a range of ancient astronomical traditions worldwide, are also marked in the wheel's geometry. What is remarkable about these alignments is not merely that they exist, but that they have remained accurate across the span of centuries and millennia since the wheels were built. Precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the apparent position of stars in the sky to shift over long periods, means that stellar alignments valid 5,000 years ago are not the same as those valid today. Researchers can work backward from the current alignment data to calculate when specific astronomical configurations would have been visible from a given location, and those calculations have been used to cross-check and in some cases refine the radiocarbon dates obtained from cairn materials. The convergence between the astronomical and the radiocarbon evidence at sites like Majorville and Moose Mountain is one of the stronger lines of evidence for the deep antiquity of these structures and the knowledge they encode. Across the prairies, medicine wheels come in a variety of forms and scales. Some are simple single rings with no spokes. Others are complex multi-ring structures with elaborate spoke systems. Some contain burials within their central cairns. Others show no sign of mortuary use and appear to have been purely ceremonial or astronomical in function. The diversity of forms across 5,000 years suggests the medicine wheel tradition was not a single practice, but an evolving and culturally dynamic one, with different communities building in different ways while maintaining certain consistent structural and symbolic principles. The peoples of the Great Plains maintain oral traditions in which the medicine wheels are described as sacred places, places of ceremony, healing, and vision. The wheels were not simply observatories in the modern sense, instruments of precise measurement, and nothing more. They were places where the relationship between the human world and the cosmic order was enacted and renewed. The astronomical alignments were meaningful because the movements of the sun and stars were themselves meaningful, not as data points, but as living presences with which human beings needed to maintain relationship. The precision of the alignments reflects not detached scientific interest, but profound spiritual necessity. What remains genuinely difficult to explain is the degree of mathematical and astronomical sophistication required to build structures that maintain accurate solstice and stellar alignments over spans of time that exceed most of recorded history. The people who built the Majorville wheel 5,000 years ago were living in a landscape without cities, without writing, without agriculture. In the intensive sense we usually invoke when we think of civilizations capable of this kind of work. By the standard narratives of human development, they should not have possessed the knowledge required to encode stellar alignments into a ground-level stone arrangement with the accuracy that has been measured. And yet the measurements speak for themselves. The precision is there. The knowledge was there. The question of how it was acquired, maintained, and transmitted across generations of a mobile people, across 5,000 years of change, remains genuinely and beautifully open. At the northern tip of Newfoundland, where the land ends abruptly at a series of low grass-covered headlands above the Strait of Belle Isle, sits the only confirmed Norse site in North America outside of Greenland. Lance aux Meadows was discovered in 1960 by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steen Ingstad, following a tip from a local fisherman who had noticed unusual mounds in the landscape near the village of Hay Cove. What the Ingstads and their subsequent excavation teams found beneath those mounds was the remains of a Norse settlement, turf-walled longhouses, a smithy, a carpentry workshop, and a range of artifacts, including a bronze cloak pin of unmistakably Norse design. The site dates to approximately the year 1000 CE and is accepted by the world's archaeological community as the remains of the Vinland described in the Norse sagas, the landfall in North America first reached by Leif Erikson, roughly 5 centuries before Columbus's Atlantic crossing. Lance aux Meadows is remarkable as a site, and its acceptance by mainstream archaeology represents an important victory for evidence over prior assumption. For much of the 20th century, the idea that Norse voyagers had reached North America was treated with skepticism bordering on contempt in academic circles, despite the very clear description of a western land called Vinland in multiple independent saga sources. The physical evidence at Lance aux Meadows settled the debate definitively and permanently. The Norse were here, the sagas were telling the truth. But Lance aux Meadows, as extraordinary as it is, raises more questions than it answers. The settlement is small, with evidence of no more than 60 to 90 people at any one time, and it shows signs of only brief occupation, perhaps a decade or so at most. It does not look like a colony, but like an exploratory camp, a base of operations from which expeditions were launched further south and west. The sagas describe Vinland as being rich in wild grapes, a feature entirely inconsistent with the climate of northern Newfoundland, but consistent with the Gulf of St. Lawrence region or areas further south. The site at L'Anse aux Meadows, researchers have argued, is not Vinland itself, but the gateway to it. This distinction matters enormously. If the Norse were using L'Anse aux Meadows as a base from which to explore further into the continent, the question of how far they went and what they found is wide open. The sagas describe encounters with indigenous peoples called skraeling in the Norse accounts that span multiple voyages and involve both trade and conflict. The locations described, with their forests, rivers, and milder climate, suggest explorations that may have extended well into the present-day Canadian maritime provinces along the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and possibly further still. Some researchers have proposed that Norse exploration reached as far as the shores of Hudson Bay or even the interior of the continent. The physical evidence for such extended exploration remains sparse, but it has not been entirely absent. In 2015, satellite imagery analysis and subsequent ground investigation led a research team to identify what may be a second Norse site at Point Rosie on the southwestern tip of Newfoundland. The site showed features consistent with Norse construction, including the remains of what appeared to be a turf wall and an area of roasting rocks associated with iron processing. However, subsequent excavation by a different team produced ambiguous results, and the identification of Point Rosie as a Norse site remains contested. The investigation is ongoing, and the question of whether additional Norse outposts exist along Canada's Atlantic coast has not been closed. But the Norse, as important as they are to this story, are far from the only or even the earliest potential visitors to Canadian shores from across the Atlantic. A growing body of physical, linguistic, and genetic evidence points toward the possibility of earlier contact between the Old World and the populations of northeastern North America that predates the Norse voyages by centuries or even millennia. The genetic evidence is among the most intriguing. Studies of the genomes of indigenous peoples of the Atlantic coast and interior have identified markers that do not fit neatly into the prevailing model of a single founding population entering North America from Siberia. Certain haplogroups found in the Mi'kmaq and other eastern woodland peoples have distributions in the Old World that have prompted researchers to ask careful questions about the directions in which they might have traveled. The debate is not resolved, and the interpretation of population genetics data in the context of deep prehistory is notoriously complex. But the data exists, and it warrants serious investigation. The linguistic evidence adds another layer of complexity. The Mi'kmaq language of the maritime provinces contains a number of words that have been compared, with varying degrees of rigor, to words in Celtic and particularly Basque languages. The Basques are an especially interesting case. Basque fishermen were working the Grand Banks of Newfoundland for cod, at least by the early 16th century, and possibly considerably earlier. There is strong documentary evidence, including the names of local geographic features recorded by early European explorers that appear to be Basque in origin, that Basque fishing operations in Canadian waters predated official European knowledge of the continent. How much earlier remains a matter of ongoing investigation. What all of this points to is a picture of pre-Columbian contact that is more complex, more multidirectional, and involving a greater number of peoples and time periods than the simple narrative of Columbus in 1492 can contain. Canada's Atlantic and Gulf coasts were not isolated from the Old World for the entire period before European colonization. The shores and rivers and forests of what is now Atlantic Canada were known to more peoples, from more directions, over a longer span of time than the official history acknowledges. The ruins at L'Anse aux Meadows are not the beginning of that story. They may not even be close to the beginning. Off the southern coast of Nova Scotia, connected to the mainland by a causeway that replaced the original rowboat crossing, sits an island so thoroughly investigated, so extensively dug, and so stubbornly resistant to yielding its secrets that it has become one of the most expensive and most obsessive treasure hunts in human history. Oak Island is roughly half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, forested and flat, unremarkable in appearance to someone passing by on the water. But since the summer of 1795, when a teenager named Daniel McGinnis first noticed a circular depression in the ground beneath a scarred and ancient oak tree, the island has consumed fortunes, claimed lives, and defied every attempt to determine what, if anything, is buried in the depths of what has come to be known as the Money Pit. The basics of the Money Pit story are familiar to anyone who has followed the island's long history of excavation. McGinnis and two friends began digging at the site of the depression and found, as they descended through the clay soil, a series of wooden platforms laid every 10 feet, each appearing to seal off the shaft below. The platforms were made of oak logs and showed signs of having been carefully placed rather than naturally deposited. At a depth of 90 feet, the boys reportedly found a flat stone inscribed with marks that some later researchers claimed could be decoded as a message indicating treasure lay buried 40 feet below. When water began flooding the shaft at just over 90 feet, the excavation was halted. It would be the first of many times that floodwater would defeat a team digging toward whatever lies at the bottom. Subsequent excavations over the following 2 centuries and more have repeatedly encountered the same phenomenon. The Money Pit floods with seawater whenever it is excavated below a certain depth, suggesting the presence of one or more elaborate drainage tunnels engineered to connect the pit to the ocean. Various investigators over the years have identified what they believe are flood tunnels, running from certain beaches on the island's southern shore to the pit itself, angled to allow seawater to pour in when the shaft below a certain depth is breached. Whether these tunnels are naturally occurring features of the island's geology or engineered constructions is a question that has been argued continuously for over 2 centuries. The engineering required to build such a system, if it is artificial, would have been substantial and would imply a level of planning and resources inconsistent with a simple burial operation by a small group. Over the years, various objects and materials have been retrieved from the depths of the Money Pit and from the surrounding area of the island. These include fragments of oak wood at extreme depths, coconut fiber discovered at a beach area far from any natural coconut habitat, bits of material analyzed as parchment with traces of inscription, a small gold chain of considerable antiquity, and a lead cross whose origins have been debated at considerable length by multiple researchers. None of these individual items is conclusive. Each is consistent with a range of possible explanations. Together, they sustain the conviction of those who believe something significant was deliberately placed on this island at some point in the past. The question of who might have built the Money Pit, assuming it to be an artificial construction, has attracted speculation across a remarkable range. Francis Bacon's manuscripts, The Treasure of the Knights Templar, The Ark of the Covenant, Pirate Treasure from the Golden Age of Caribbean Buccaneering, French naval valuables removed from Louisbourg before its fall in 1758, the original plays of Shakespeare, Inca gold transported somehow to Nova Scotia during the Spanish colonial period. These are among the candidates that have been proposed and argued over by generations of researchers and enthusiasts. The pirate theory has perhaps the most straightforward historical plausibility, since the late 17th and early 18th centuries saw considerable pirate activity in maritime Canadian waters, and the engineering capabilities required for the construction, while considerable, would not have been beyond a well-organized group of men with maritime skills and access to tools and time. But there are features of the site that resist even the pirate theory. If the money pit was engineered by pirates to conceal treasure, the engineering they employed was extraordinarily complex, involving not just a deep shaft and wooden platforms, but a drainage system of tunnel engineering that would have required months of skilled labor to construct. Most pirates were not in the business of building permanent underground infrastructure. The Oak Island system, if the various investigations' findings are accurate, represents something more deliberate and more permanent than a standard cache. There is also the geological context to consider. Bedrock on Oak Island sits at depth ranges that interact with the flooding mechanism in ways some investigators have argued are consistent with natural formation rather than artificial engineering. A counter-argument to the entire premise of the money pit holds that what McGinnis and his friends found in 1795 was not an engineered vault, but a naturally occurring sinkhole or pit feature, that the wooden platforms were the remains of natural organic material deposited during various stages of the pit's natural formation, and that the subsequent flood of water was simply the island's natural water table behavior when the shaft intersected an underground conduit. Under this interpretation, there is nothing deliberately buried on Oak Island, and 2 centuries of digging have been directed at a natural geological accident. This interpretation has the advantage of parsimony, but it struggles with certain pieces of physical evidence. The coconut fiber found at Smith's Cove on the island's southern shore, carbon dated to approximately the early medieval period, is difficult to explain within the framework of natural deposition. Coconut palms do not grow in Nova Scotia, and coconut fiber, which was historically used as packing and rope material aboard ships operating in tropical waters, would have had to be transported to the island deliberately by someone who had either traveled to tropical regions themselves or who traded with people who had. Whether that coconut fiber is connected to whatever is or was in the money pit, or whether it represents some entirely separate period of human activity on the island, remains unknown. The excavations continue. The island has been the subject of extensive investigation with new technology, including drilling, core sampling, and sonar mapping revealing previously unknown features of the island's underground geography. A large chamber-like void has been identified at depth by various scanning methods, its dimensions and contents unknown. Whether that void is an engineered space, a natural cave, or an artifact of the scanning methods themselves remains to be determined. The island offers new data and new ambiguity with each new investigation. It has been doing so for more than 2 centuries, and it shows no sign of stopping. What Oak Island represents, regardless of what eventually is or is not found in its depths, is a question about the pre-Columbian history of Canada's Atlantic coast. Someone at some point took this small and unremarkable island seriously enough to invest significant labor and skill in it. The island's position at the edge of the North Atlantic, within reach of maritime routes that could theoretically originate from Europe or follow the coast north from the Caribbean, places it in a geographic context that is historically significant. Whatever is at the bottom of the money pit, or whatever was there and has since been removed or dissolved or destroyed, the effort that went into the site was not casual. It was deliberate, sustained, and carried out by people who expected it to last. In 1936, a prospector and miner named James Edward Dodd claimed to have found while blasting a rock cut near the town of Beardmore in northern Ontario, a collection of medieval objects that include a broken iron sword, a pair of iron rattle handles attached to a ring, and a piece of iron described as a shield boss. The objects, clearly not of indigenous manufacture, appeared to Dodd to be Viking in origin, and he eventually sold them to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto for $500. The museum displayed them as genuine Norse artifacts, supporting the hypothesis that Norse explorers had penetrated deep into the interior of Canada and reached the vicinity of Lake Nipigon in northern Ontario, several hundred miles from the nearest saltwater coastline. The Beardmore relics became the subject of intense scrutiny almost immediately. A neighbor of Dodd's came forward to claim that the objects had not been found in a rock cut, but had been brought to Canada by Dodd himself, having come originally from a Norwegian immigrant who had stored them in Dodd's basement. This claim initiated a controversy that would last for decades and that has never been entirely resolved. The museum's own investigations in the years following the purchase produced conflicting evidence. Some supporters of the find's authenticity and some who found the provenance story inconsistent and impossible to verify through the available documentation. The Beardmore case is complicated by the genuine Norse artifacts found at L'Anse aux Meadows, which were not discovered until 1960, and which demonstrated definitively that Norse peoples had reached North America. Had the Beardmore relics been found after L'Anse aux Meadows was accepted, the institutional climate might have been more receptive to taking them seriously. Instead, they arrived in a period when the very idea of Norse presence in North America was treated with deep skepticism by the majority of the academic establishment, and the institutional pressure to dismiss them was considerable. More recent re-examination of the objects and of the historical record surrounding them has not resolved the question, but has raised the possibility, held by a minority of researchers, that the story is more complex than a simple fraud. The objects themselves, examined metallurgically, are consistent in their composition and corrosion patterns with genuine medieval Norse manufacture. The style of the sword, while consistent with a type known from Norse graves of the 9th to 11th centuries, is also consistent with a class of objects that were being collected and sold by antique dealers in Norway and Scandinavia during the early 20th century. Whether Dodd acquired them through legitimate purchase and brought them to Canada, or whether he found them in a rock cut as he claimed, cannot be determined from the evidence available. What the Beardmore case illustrates, beyond its specific details, is the way in which the institutional context of a discovery can determine its reception regardless of the quality of the physical evidence. The relics arrived at a moment when they were almost certain to be questioned regardless of their authenticity, and the questioning itself became the story that overshadowed whatever the objects themselves might have to say. The more interesting question, which the controversy over provenance tends to obscure, is whether Norse materials could plausibly be found in northern Ontario. The answer, given everything now known about the range of Norse exploration in North America, is not an obvious no. Norse geographical knowledge of North America extended well beyond L'Anse aux Meadows. The sagas describe a coastline stretching south and west for considerable distances, with large rivers, interior forests, and populations of indigenous people spread across a wide area. The Norse were skilled navigators of river systems as well as coastlines, and their use of L'Anse aux Meadows as a base implies exploration that likely followed the rivers and coasts of the maritime provinces and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. From the mouth of the St. Lawrence, a river route deeper into the continent would not have been inaccessible to people who possessed the skill and motivation to travel it. The great waterways of the Canadian interior, the Ottawa River, the French River, the system of lakes stretching to Superior, were traveled repeatedly by much later fur traders following routes they knew indigenous peoples had used before them. There is no structural reason why Norse explorers could not have followed similar routes centuries earlier. The Beardmore relics remain in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum, their authenticity and provenance officially in dispute. They sit in storage, neither displayed as genuine nor destroyed as fraudulent, occupying the uncertain territory between proven and disproven that so many of Canada's most interesting ancient discoveries occupy. They are a physical question without an answer, waiting for a form of analysis or a documentary discovery that may or may not ever arrive. Improved metallurgical techniques and methods for establishing manufacturing provenance from trace element signatures mean the question is not necessarily permanently closed. An analysis rigorous enough to establish beyond reasonable doubt whether the Beardmore sword is genuinely from a 9th century Norse forge, or whether it is a 19th century reproduction, or whether it is something in between, is technically possible with the methods available today. Whether anyone will ever invest the effort and resources required to conduct that analysis is a different question entirely, one whose answer depends on decisions made in institutions far from the quiet storage room where the relics wait. Northern Ontario itself, the country through which Dodd worked as a prospector, is one of the least archaeologically surveyed regions in Canada. Its remote lakes and rivers and boreal forests have never been systematically examined for evidence of pre-contact activity by non-Indigenous peoples. The possibility that physical evidence of Norse or other Old World presence exists in that landscape, waiting for a survey that has never been conducted, is not fanciful. It is simply unaddressed. Along the shores and in the interior of Nova Scotia, researchers beginning in the mid-20th century have identified a series of markings on rock surfaces that some have interpreted as Ogham script, the notched and linear writing system associated with early Celtic peoples, particularly the Irish and the Scots of the late first millennium CE. The identifications are controversial, rejected by most mainstream archaeologists, but they have been made by multiple independent researchers working in different parts of the province, and the locations of the claimed inscriptions bear a striking geographic relationship to the routes of pre-Columbian Atlantic navigation. Ogham is a script that consists of groups of horizontal or diagonal lines incised across a central stem line, with each group representing a letter of an early Celtic alphabet. It is found primarily on standing stones in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and southwestern England, typically as memorial inscriptions naming deceased individuals. The earliest examples date to around the 4th century CE, and the tradition continued in various forms through the early medieval period. Ogham can be difficult to distinguish from natural rock scoring, which is produced by geological processes, including glacial abrasion, and from deliberate indigenous markings that may superficially resemble the script's linear structure. The researcher most associated with the identification of Nova Scotia Ogham inscriptions is the same Barry Fell who examined the Peterborough petroglyphs. Fell worked extensively in Nova Scotia during the 1970s and 1980s and identified multiple sites where he believed Ogham was present. His interpretations generated the same mixture of popular interest and academic rejection that his Peterborough work had produced. The mainstream archaeological community's response was, again, largely dismissive, pointing to the difficulty of distinguishing deliberate inscription from natural rock scoring and questioning the rigor of the linguistic analyses. But Fell was not alone in making these identifications. A Nova Scotian researcher working independently and with greater attention to local geological context identified a series of what he considered unambiguous Ogham inscriptions on a coastal rock face, documenting the sites carefully with photography and cartography. His work was not as theoretically expansive as Fell's, focusing on careful documentation of specific sites rather than broad cultural claims, and it attracted somewhat more serious consideration before ultimately being set aside by the provincial archaeological establishment. The geographic context of the claimed inscriptions adds a layer of interest that the inscriptions themselves cannot provide alone. Nova Scotia sits at the western end of the North Atlantic, in a position that would be the natural first landfall for a vessel following the northern Great Circle route from the British Isles across the Atlantic. This is the same route that takes a navigator through Icelandic and Greenlandic waters before reaching Newfoundland and the maritime provinces, the same route the Norse used, and that Basque fishermen may have used before their voyages were formally documented. Irish monks of the early medieval period, known as the Culdees, are historically documented to have engaged in voyages of what they called white martyrdom, setting off into the ocean in small boats to find isolated places of prayer and contemplation. The monk Brendan of Clonfert is the subject of a navigational narrative, the Navigatio Brendani, that describes a voyage to an island far to the west, containing features that have been interpreted as consistent with North American geography. Whether Brendan reached North America is a question scholars have debated for centuries, and a celebrated experimental voyage conducted by Tim Severin in a traditional Irish curragh during the 1970s demonstrated that the crossing was at least physically possible, using period-appropriate technology and navigation methods. If Irish monks or other Celtic seafarers did reach Nova Scotia in the centuries before the Norse voyages, the presence of Ogham inscriptions on coastal rocks would be exactly what one would expect to find. Celtic peoples used Ogham on stone as a way of marking territory, recording names, and communicating to those who came after. A group of travelers in an unknown land, conscious of the tradition of stone inscription, might well have left marks in the familiar script as a record of their presence. The inscriptions reported from Nova Scotia are not, for the most part, elaborate texts, but simple mark groupings, consistent with the kind of brief, territorial, or memorial inscriptions found on standing stones in the Celtic world. The physical landscape of Nova Scotia is itself a kind of argument. The coastline is deeply indented, with natural harbors and sheltered coves that would have been immediately recognizable as safe anchorages to anyone arriving from the sea. The interior forests and river systems would have provided food, fresh water, and materials for a small group in need of provisioning. The climate, while cold, is no harsher than Iceland, which was settled by the Norse and before them briefly by Irish monks who left traces of their presence there in the archaeological record. There is no environmental reason why Nova Scotia could not have sustained small groups of visitors from across the Atlantic at any point in the last 2,000 years. The Ogham question is ultimately a question about whether any of those visitors left marks that have survived, and the honest answer remains that the question has not been seriously enough investigated to be answered. Beneath the surface of the Great Lakes, in depths that have been accessible to modern sonar and underwater survey technology only since the late 20th century, a series of structures and features have been identified that challenge the assumption that the story of pre-contact human activity in the Great Lakes region is well understood. The lakes themselves, covering a collective surface area of more than 200,000 square kilometers and containing 20% of the world's surface fresh water, are geologically recent features formed by the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet between approximately 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. Before the ice retreated, the land now beneath the lakes was dry ground, inhabited, as the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests, by people who lived along riverbanks and lake shores that are now submerged under tens of meters of cold, clear water. In Lake Huron, approximately 40 meters below the present surface, A striking discovery was made in 2007 by a research team from the University of Michigan. Using sonar mapping of the lake bottom in the Alpena Amberley Ridge area, a submerged ridge that once would have formed a land bridge connecting what is now Michigan to what is now Ontario, the team identified a series of linear stone arrangements on the lake floor that did not correspond to any known geological formation process. Further investigation, including underwater drone surveys and diver examination, confirmed that the structures were real and that at least some of them appeared to be artificial in character. The most notable feature identified on the Alpena Amberley Ridge is a chevron-shaped arrangement of stones, roughly 2.5 to 3 meters wide, and formed into a V shape, associated with what appears to be a prehistoric hunting drive lane structure. Drive lanes are known from the terrestrial archaeological record across North America as features used to funnel animal herds, particularly caribou, toward kill zones where hunters waited. The Lake Huron structure, at a depth of 40 meters, would have been above water roughly 10,000 years ago, during the period immediately following the retreat of the ice, when the Great Lakes Basin was still adjusting to the removal of glacial weight and the lake levels had not yet stabilized at their current elevations. The discovery of what appears to be a prehistoric hunting structure at 40 meters depth in Lake Huron is not, in isolation, astonishing. It is exactly what the geology predicts should be there, evidence of human activity on land that was later flooded. But it represents a category of discovery that has profound implications for our understanding of the human history of the Great Lakes region. If hunting features survived underwater at that depth in Lake Huron, similar features almost certainly exist in other areas of the lake and in the other Great Lakes. The submerged landscape of the Great Lakes Basin is, in a meaningful sense, a vast and largely unexplored archaeological site. The land surfaces now under 40, 50, or 60 meters of water were inhabited ground for thousands of years before the flooding occurred, and they hold the physical record of that habitation intact. In Lake Ontario, a different kind of underwater mystery has attracted attention. Multiple sonar surveys of the lake bottom in the deeper central basin have identified objects and configurations that do not fit the profile of natural geological features. Some of these have been attributed to post-contact human activity, including the wreckage of vessels from the era of Great Lakes shipping. But others, located in areas distant from known shipping lanes and associated with no documented human activity in the historical period, have prompted questions that have not been answered. The interpretation of lake bottom features is technically demanding, requiring extensive ground truthing of sonar data through underwater physical investigation, and the resources for that kind of systematic work in deep freshwater are limited. Georgian Bay, the large inlet of Lake Huron that lies between the Bruce Peninsula and the Canadian Shield, has a long history of indigenous occupation along its shores. The bay is dotted with thousands of islands, many of which show evidence of ancient use, and its shores contain numerous sites of archaeological significance. Several researchers working in the region have reported finding, at low water levels following periods of drought, stone features along the shoreline and in the intertidal zone that do not conform to natural rock formation patterns. These include roughly circular stone arrangements, lines of stone running perpendicular to the shoreline, and what appear to be modified sections of bedrock. Whether these features are ancient and whether they are artificial has not been systematically investigated. For the early peoples who hunted along the shores of Proto-Lake Huron and built drive lanes on what is now submerged bedrock, the landscape they inhabited was not the one we see today. The lakes were lower, the rivers were different, the land bridges between islands and peninsulas were above water. The ecology of the basin in the immediate post-glacial period included species, including woodland caribou in large numbers that no longer occupy the region. The people who built the Alpana Amberley Ridge structure were living in a world that has since been entirely transformed, a world that now lies preserved in cold water, 40 meters below the kayaks and fishing boats on the surface above. Their tools, their hearths, their structures, all of it may be down there, waiting for the technology and the resources and the will to find it. In the summer of 1961, a construction worker was operating machinery in a gravel quarry near the town of Taber in southern Alberta when he encountered fragments of human bone eroding from the quarry wall. The bones were small, clearly from a child or infant, and had been partially destroyed by the machinery before he noticed them and stopped work. What remained was a partial skull, fragments of a lower jaw, and several postcranial fragments. The bones were collected and eventually made their way to physical anthropologists who began the process of trying to determine who the individual known as the Taber child had been and when they had lived. The initial analysis produced an age estimate for the individual based on dental development and bone fusion of somewhere between 1 and 2 years at the time of death. The sex of the individual could not be determined from the available fragments. The more significant question was the age of the bones themselves, and here the analysis became complicated in ways that have never been fully resolved. The stratigraphic context of the bones placed them in a geological layer that, based on the sequence of deposits in the quarry, could be correlated with sediments dating to the final stages of the last glaciation or the immediate post-glacial period. Early estimates placed the bones at approximately 30,000 years old, a figure that would have made them the oldest human remains found in Canada and among the oldest in the Americas. These extreme early dates attracted considerable academic attention and considerable skepticism. Subsequent radiocarbon dating of the bones themselves produced much younger dates, with results clustering in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 years before the present. This result effectively removed the Taber child from the category of extraordinary early American specimens and placed the remains within the chronological range of the well-documented archaeological record of the Great Plains. The earlier extreme dates, based on stratigraphic correlation rather than direct measurement of the bones, were abandoned, and the case faded from the kind of intense scrutiny it had initially attracted. But the question of the bones' true age has not been settled as definitively as the standard narrative suggests. The radiocarbon dates obtained from the fragments were taken from bone samples that had been subjected to unknown degrees of contamination during the decades the specimens spent in various institutional collections before systematic radiocarbon analysis was performed. Contamination of bone samples with younger carbon, whether from organic materials in the surrounding sediment, from handling, or from chemical treatments applied during preservation, is a known source of error in bone radiocarbon dating, and contaminated samples systematically produce dates that are younger than the true age of the material. Researchers who have examined the Taber case have noted that the stratigraphic argument for great antiquity, while not conclusive, was not as easily dismissed as the subsequent narrative implied. Alberta in the immediate post-glacial period was a dramatically different environment from the province today. As the Laurentide ice sheet retreated northward, it left behind a landscape of meltwater lakes, moraines, and gradually colonizing vegetation, moving through stages from tundra to parkland to grassland as the climate stabilized. The southern Alberta plains were among the first habitable environments to emerge from glaciation in the region, and the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that human populations followed the retreating ice edge closely, moving into newly available habitat as it became accessible. Early human presence in southern Alberta would not be geologically implausible. The question is whether the Tabor child represents that early presence or simply a standard archaeological deposit from the middle period of the current geological epoch. The fragments remain in institutional custody, their age technically uncertain, their significance dependent on the resolution of a methodological dispute that no one has invested the resources to fully adjoin. They are among the most physically significant pieces of human material from the early Canadian archaeological record, and their story remains unfinished in the way that the most interesting stories often do. The Pacific coast of Canada is among the richest and most complex environments for human habitation anywhere on Earth. The temperate rainforest coast stretching from the Fraser River Delta northward through the islands and fjords of British Columbia and into Alaska combines abundant marine resources, a mild maritime climate, and a landscape of extraordinary biological productivity. The archaeological record of this coast is long, reaching back at least 14,000 years to the period immediately following the last glaciation, and it is associated with some of the most sophisticated material cultures of any pre-contact period anywhere in the Americas. But within that well-documented record, there are anomalies. There are sites and materials that do not fit neatly into the standard narrative of coastal peoples, developing in isolation from Old World influences until the first documented European maritime contacts of the 18th century. These anomalies take several forms, and they point in unexpected directions. The genetic evidence is perhaps the most compelling at a technical level. Studies of the genomes of indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast have consistently identified a genetic signature that, in its distribution and character, points toward ancestry not fully accounted for by the standard Beringian migration model. One particularly striking finding, reported by a research team in the mid-2010s, identified genetic markers in some indigenous populations of the Pacific Northwest that show statistical affinity with genomes from populations in Australasia and from certain other populations from the island chains of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Under the dominant model, which envisions the founding population of the Americas as having entered through a Beringian corridor from Northeast Asia, such signatures should not be present. The researchers who reported these findings were careful to note multiple possible explanations, including complex population movements within the Americas that could have brought such signatures indirectly, and they were cautious in their conclusions. But the data was real and has been replicated in subsequent analyses. There was, at some point in the ancient past, a source of genetic material in the ancestry of certain Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples that does not derive from the standard Northeastern Asian founding population. Whether that represents an ancient coastal migration route, a separate entry by people following island chains across the North Pacific, or some other unrecognized process remains unknown. The material culture of the Pacific Northwest adds another dimension to this question. The maritime technology of the coast's pre-contact peoples was sophisticated in ways that point toward deep experience with open water navigation. The Haida and their neighbors built and operated large ocean-going canoes capable of extended voyages well beyond sight of land. Their knowledge of Pacific currents, weather patterns, and navigation was extensive and encoded in traditions maintained across generations. Whether any of those traditions include the memory of contacts with peoples from across the Pacific is a question that has been raised but not resolved. Off the coast of British Columbia, beneath the waters of the continental shelf, a similar underwater archaeology question arises as in the Great Lakes. The continental shelf off the BC coast was above water during the last glaciation, extending the habitable coastline significantly further west than the present shoreline. Kelp forests and rich intertidal zones would have made that ancient coast an extraordinarily productive place to live, and the hypothesis that the earliest Americans traveled down the Pacific coast rather than through an interior corridor is now taken seriously by mainstream archaeology. If that coastal migration route was real, much of the physical evidence for it is now underwater, on a continental shelf that has been only partially surveyed. The ancient BC coast is, like the Great Lakes Basin, a landscape waiting to be discovered beneath the cold water of the Pacific. The Yukon is a place that most Canadians think of in terms of the gold rush of 1896 and 1897, the stampede of fortune seekers that transformed a remote river valley into a legendary landscape of hardship, discovery, and brief fortunes. But the Klondike region and the broader Yukon Territory hold a prehistory that makes the gold rush look like a recent event, a prehistory that in some respects represents the oldest chapter in the entire Canadian human story. Bluefish Caves, located in the Yukon near the confluence of the Bluefish and Old Crow rivers, have produced what is currently the oldest accepted evidence of human presence in Canada. The caves, 3 small limestone chambers in a river bluff above the Old Crow Flats, were excavated beginning in the 1970s by paleontologist Jacques Cinq-Mars, and the materials recovered from them include stone tools and, crucially, animal bones bearing cut marks and percussion marks consistent with human butchering activity. The bones are from extinct Pleistocene fauna, mammoth, horse, camel, and other large animals that disappeared from the Yukon at the end of the last glaciation. Radiocarbon dates on the bone material, using the most modern accelerator mass spectrometry techniques available, have placed the human-modified specimens at approximately 24,000 years before the present. 24,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time when measured against the scales of human history most people carry in their heads. It places human activity in the Yukon roughly 15,000 years before the earliest dates accepted for the Clovis culture, and 10,000 years before the oldest accepted dates from any site in the contiguous United States. It means that people were living in the Yukon, hunting mammoth and horse in the cold steppe environment of the late Pleistocene, at a time when Europe was still deep in the last glacial maximum, when the entire area that would become British Columbia and most of Canada was buried under ice. Cinq-Mars' findings at Bluefish Caves were treated with the same institutional skepticism that met Thomas Lee's work at Shigeanda. For decades after his initial publications, the Bluefish dates were not widely accepted, with critics arguing that the stone tools might be intrusive and the animal bone modifications might be attributable to carnivore activity rather than human agency. Cinq-Mars, like Lee, found his work marginalized and his institutional support diminished. He died in 2004 without seeing his findings achieve mainstream acceptance. But in 2017, a reanalysis of the Bluefish Caves, bone assemblage by a team that included researchers with no institutional connection to Cinq-Mars' original work, produced a methodologically rigorous confirmation of the human modification evidence. Using a systematic examination of cut mark morphology and position that distinguish between human and carnivore modifications. With statistical confidence, the team confirmed that a substantial portion of the identified specimens showed unambiguous evidence of human processing. The reanalysis produced dates consistent with Cinq-Mars' original findings, and it was published in a mainstream journal and achieved wide acceptance. The pre-24,000-year human presence at Bluefish Caves is now considered established by most researchers working in the field of early American prehistory. The implications of Bluefish Caves for the broader story of human arrival in the Americas are profound. If people were living in the Yukon 24,000 years ago, they must have arrived there from somewhere, and they must have managed somehow during the period when the interior of North America was sealed off by confluent glacial sheets. The Beringian land bridge, available during periods of glacial sea level lowering, would have provided a terrestrial route to the region, but the ice would have prevented southward movement toward the rest of the continent until approximately 14,000 years ago. The Bluefish Cave people must either have remained in the Beringian refugium for thousands of years waiting for the ice to recede, or found another way forward, a coastal route following the kelp highway of the ice-free Pacific coast, or a maritime approach across the North Pacific. The question remains open, and the Yukon holds the evidence that will help answer it. What this means is that the Klondike Valley and the Old Crow Flats, now quiet and remote and traversed mainly by the Vuntut, Gwich'in First Nation and the occasional researcher, were once a crossroads of the human journey into an unknown hemisphere. The gold that brought 50,000 frantic fortune seekers into the Klondike in 1897 was a superficial geological accident. The deeper treasure of the Yukon is the evidence it holds for the story of when and how and by what paths humanity first populated the western half of the earth. What emerges from the accumulated evidence surveyed across this long journey is a picture of Canadian prehistory that is richer, more complex, and more deeply layered than the accepted narrative presents. The standard story of Canadian history begins effectively with the Norse around the year 1000 CE and with the sustained European contact of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Everything before the Norse is treated as the prehistory of the indigenous peoples, a story usually presented in broad strokes without the granular depth that the physical evidence actually permits. But the evidence demands more than that. The medicine wheels of the prairies were built by people who possessed detailed and astronomical knowledge and the mathematical ability to encode it in permanent stone. The builders of the Majorville cairn were doing this 5,000 years ago with a precision that modern survey methods have confirmed and that no standard narrative of late Stone Age development in the New World adequately explains. The tools at Shegianda may represent human occupation of Lake Huron's shore during or immediately after the last glaciation, placing people in central Canada at a time when the continent was still largely covered in ice. The genetic signals in both the Atlantic and Pacific indigenous populations point toward ancestral connections with Old World populations that the simple Beringian migration model alone cannot account for. The underwater landscape of the Great Lakes holds the physical record of 10,000 years of habitation that has never been properly surveyed. None of this requires the conclusion that any specific fringe theory is correct. The evidence does not demand that the Knights Templar buried treasure on Oak Island, or that Celtic monks founded a colony in Nova Scotia, or that the Peterborough petroglyphs were carved by Phoenician sailors. What it demands, more modestly and more rigorously, is that the pre-Columbian human history of Canada was more complicated than the textbook version acknowledges, and that the questions raised by these sites and artifacts deserve serious, well-funded, and intellectually open investigation. The institutional resistance that has met so many of these discoveries reflects not a careful weighing of evidence, but a prior commitment to a narrative that the evidence is increasingly straining to contain. Good science is not the defense of established models against inconvenient data. Good science is the revision of models when the data requires it. The data from Canadian prehistory has been requiring revision of the standard model for decades. That revision is slowly and unevenly occurring. The broader cultural significance of this prehistoric complexity is not merely academic. Canada is a country whose national identity is still in the process of being understood and articulated, a process that necessarily involves grappling, honestly, with the history of the land and all the peoples who have inhabited it. The indigenous peoples of Canada have oral traditions that speak of a deep past, of migrations and transformations and encounters with other peoples, of a human presence on this land that extends far back beyond any date the written colonial record acknowledges. The archaeological and geological evidence increasingly supports the fundamental principle behind those traditions, that the human story of Canada is ancient, layered, and far from fully told. There is something quietly staggering about sitting with the full weight of this picture in the dark of a quiet evening. Under the lakes, under the prairies, under the forests of the Shield and the glacial debris of the north, under the bogs of the maritime coast and the river silts of the Yukon, the evidence of an ancient and deeply human presence accumulates. Stone by stone, bone by bone, carved mark by carved mark, a story is being recovered that is slower and more patient than the timelines of history usually allow for. A story told in materials that last rather than in languages that can be forgotten. The people who built the Majorville medicine wheel 5,000 years ago looked at the same stars we look at tonight. They watched the summer solstice sunrise clear the horizon and saw their stone arrangements lit exactly as they had calculated. It would be lit. They knew something about the sky and the earth and the relationship between them that we are only now, through the slow machinery of archaeology and astronomy working together, beginning to decode. That knowledge was not primitive. It was precise. It was encoded in stone on the open prairie, and it has waited 5,000 years for someone to read it again. In the cold freshwater basin of Lake Superior, the largest of the Great Lakes, and the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, there lies a mystery that archaeologists have struggled to fully account for since the first systematic surveys of the lake's shoreline were conducted in the 19th century. Along the remote northern and western shores of the lake, principally in what is now the Ontario and Minnesota sides of the watershed, ancient peoples extracted copper in quantities so extraordinary and by methods so systematic that the operation must be considered one of the largest mining enterprises in the prehistoric Americas. The copper of Lake Superior was worked over a period of at least 7,000 years, from roughly 5,000 BCE to roughly 1500 BCE, in a tradition known to archaeologists as the Old Copper Complex. The scale of extraction was vast. Estimates based on the volume of mine pits and the total weight of copper artifacts found across the Great Lakes and eastern North America suggest that many millions of pounds of pure native copper were removed from the earth over the course of this tradition. Where most of it went is one of the great unresolved questions of North American archaeology. Native copper, meaning copper that occurs in its metallic form rather than in oxide or sulfide, ores requiring smelting, is found in only a few places on Earth in quantities large enough for prehistoric exploitation. The largest deposits of native copper in the world are on and around the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan and in the islands and shorelines of the northern Lake Superior Basin, particularly on Isle Royale and along the Ontonagon River. This copper is remarkably pure, averaging 99% or better, and it occurs in masses ranging from small nuggets to enormous boulders weighing many tons. It was recognized and used by indigenous peoples throughout the region for thousands of years before the European arrival. The old copper complex mines are found on both the American and Canadian shores of Lake Superior. On the Canadian side, ancient mine pits have been documented along the north shore of the lake from Thunder Bay westward, in areas that require considerable effort to reach even today. The miners who worked these sites in the millennia before the Common Era had no metal tools of their own with which to work the rock. They used a technique known as fire cracking, heating the rock face with fire and then rapidly cooling it with water, causing the thermal shock to fracture the stone and expose the copper veins beneath. They then used stone hammers, some of them extremely large and heavy, to break the copper free from its matrix and to rough shape it into workable forms. The volume of stone hammerheads found at Lake Superior copper extraction sites is staggering. Thousands upon thousands of hammerstones, many of them polished smooth by use, have been recovered from the mine sites and from nearby deposits. Some of the largest mining pits are enormous, excavated to depths of many meters and extending over large surface areas. The labor required to produce the volume of copper that the archaeological evidence implies was extracted would have demanded not small family bands working casually, but organized groups of specialized workers returning to the mining sites over many generations. What was done with all that copper is the central mystery. The copper artifacts found in the archaeological record of eastern North America, while numerous and distributed across an extraordinarily wide area, do not account for anything like the total volume implied by the mining evidence. Copper tools and ornaments from the old copper complex have been found in sites from Nova Scotia to Alberta, from Ontario to Louisiana, distributed through trade networks of remarkable geographic extent. But even accounting for all of the copper artifacts yet found, the accounting does not balance. A very large fraction of the copper that was extracted from Lake Superior over 7,000 years is simply not present in the North American archaeological record. Various explanations have been proposed for this gap. Copper objects, unlike stone tools, can be melted down and recast indefinitely, meaning that a copper spear point could be reforged into a copper bracelet and later reforged again into a copper bowl, with none of the intermediate forms surviving. If the vast majority of Lake Superior copper was continuously recycled within North American societies, rather than being deposited in contexts where it could be preserved, the archaeological absence might be explainable without recourse to anything unusual. This is a reasonable and internally consistent hypothesis, and it may well be the correct one. But a minority of researchers, including some with solid academic credentials, have proposed a different explanation. They have noted that the scale and organization of the Lake Superior copper extraction operation has more in common with a commercial mining enterprise, operating to supply a distant market, than with a domestic extraction operation supplying local needs. The systematic nature of the mining, the sheer volume of production, and the absence of the majority of the product from the regional archaeological record, they argue, is more consistent with a scenario in which the copper was being traded across the Atlantic to Old World markets that were experiencing a severe shortage of copper during a period when the Bronze Age of Europe and the Mediterranean was at its height. The Bronze Age of the Old World, which extended roughly from 3000 BCE to roughly 1200 BCE, required enormous quantities of copper, since bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. The known copper sources of the Old World in Cyprus, Sardinia, and the Balkans have been analyzed metallurgically, and their chemical signatures are well established. When researchers have analyzed Bronze Age copper artifacts from Northern Europe, some have found chemical signatures that do not match any known Old World source, but that are consistent with Lake Superior copper. This finding, reported by a small number of researchers, has not been widely accepted and has been disputed on methodological grounds. But it has not been definitively refuted either, and it represents exactly the kind of physical evidence that the hypothesis of transatlantic copper trade would require. The north shore of Lake Superior, seen in the context of all these open questions, is not simply a beautiful and remote stretch of Canadian wilderness. It is a place where, for 7,000 years, something was happening on a scale and with an organization that demands explanation. The people who ran the mines knew what they were doing. They had specific knowledge of where the best copper was, specific techniques for extracting it, and specific destinations for what they produced. Whether those destinations were solely within North America or whether they included ports of trade that connected to far older networks across the ocean remains, for now, an open question. In the river valleys and along the rocky shores of the lower St. Lawrence region in the limestone country of Quebec, north of the river, there are stone structures that do not fit comfortably into the standard archaeological account of pre-contact indigenous cultures in the region. They take the form of standing stones, some of them large, some arranged in groups or alignments, and walls or enclosures built from unmortared stone in ways that suggest more than the casual piling of field stones. The mainstream archaeological position on these structures is that they are either naturally formed geological features, the result of frost heaving and glacial deposition, or relatively recent constructions from the colonial period built by European settlers clearing farmland. But there are structures in this landscape that neither explanation accounts for satisfactorily. The lower St. Lawrence Valley is itself an ancient and geologically complex place. The river flows through a rift valley, a zone of tectonic weakness that produced the earthquakes of the Charlevoix seismic zone, one of the most seismically active regions in eastern North America. The bedrock is ancient, including some of the same Precambrian formations that underlie the Shield Country to the north, and the surface geology was heavily modified by glaciation and by the incursion of the Champlain Sea, the shallow saltwater sea that occupied the St. Lawrence lowlands immediately after the retreat of the ice about 10,000 years ago. When the Champlain Sea withdrew, it left behind a landscape of marine deposits, raised beaches, and exposed bedrock that has since been colonized by forest and modified by thousands of years of human and natural activity. Within this landscape, a number of researchers working in the region from the mid-20th century onward have documented stone structures that they argue are neither naturally formed nor the product of European colonial agriculture. The most compelling of these are the aligned standing stones, individual upright stones, or groups of stones set firmly in the ground in positions and orientations that appear deliberate. Some alignments point toward the solstice sunrise or sunset. Others are oriented toward prominent topographic features in the landscape in ways that suggest a deliberate visual relationship. The stones themselves are in some cases shaped, with faces or surfaces that appear to have been worked, rather than simply selected for natural form. The challenge in interpreting these structures is the same challenge that faces researchers examining any stone feature in a glacially modified landscape, distinguishing between what glacial processes can produce and what deliberate human action produces. Glaciers transport, deposit, and orient stones in ways that can superficially resemble intentional human arrangement. Frost heaving can push stones upright in ways that look deliberate but are purely physical. The identification of genuinely artificial structures in this environment requires careful attention to a range of criteria. The precise orientation of the stones relative to astronomical and topographic features, the selection of unusual or non-local stone types, the presence of associated artifacts or other evidence of human activity, and the pattern of the arrangement when viewed at the landscape scale rather than the individual structure scale. Researchers who have examined the Quebec standing stones most carefully have argued that at least some of the structures meet these criteria for genuine artificial construction. The selection of stones, the precision of certain orientations, and the patterning of certain groups across the landscape are, they argue, inconsistent with the variability one would expect from purely natural or accidental processes. The astronomical orientations of some alignments, when analyzed against the stellar and solar configurations of different historical periods, suggest dates of construction that range from the early post-glacial period to the late pre-contact era, a range so wide as to be almost unhelpfully broad. What the Quebec Standing Stone question ultimately comes down to is the question of whether the peoples of the lower St. Lawrence Valley participated in the broader North American tradition of monument building in stone, a tradition of which the medicine wheels and the Peterborough petroglyphs are well-documented examples. There is no structural reason why they should not have. The Algonquian and Iroquoian peoples of the St. Lawrence region were sophisticated, long-established cultures with deep relationships with the specific landscapes they inhabited. The modification of those landscapes with stone monuments of various kinds would be entirely consistent with what is known of their material culture and their cosmological traditions. The absence of such monuments from the official archaeological record of the region may reflect not their actual absence, but the limitations of the surveys that have been conducted and the interpretive frameworks that have been applied. The landscape through which the lower St. Lawrence flows is one of the most historically layered environments in Canada. It was a meeting place of peoples and traditions long before Europeans arrived, a fact encoded in the geography of the region itself, with its river routes connecting the interior to the coast, its rich fisheries drawing populations from wide areas, its forests and mineral resources sustaining complex societies across millennia. The stone structures in its river valleys and on its rocky shores deserve the kind of patient, open-minded investigation that they have not yet received. Along the interior plateau of British Columbia, in the dry grassland and pine forest country that stretches from the Fraser River eastward to the Okanagan and beyond, ancient peoples carved images into stone with a concentration and a variety that makes this region one of the most significant rock art provinces in North America. The petroglyphs and pictographs of the Columbia Plateau and the BC interior span a range of ages from the very ancient to the pre-contact centuries, and they include images and symbols that researchers are still in the process of decoding. Some of the images are straightforward in their representational content: animals, human figures, hunting scenes, ceremonial figures. Others are geometric and abstract in ways that invite multiple interpretations, and a small but significant number are sufficiently unlike anything in the known indigenous artistic traditions of the region to have prompted serious questions about who made them and what they record. The rock art of the Thompson River Valley is among the densest and most varied in the province. Images here include figures associated with the traditions of the Nlaka'pamux people who have lived in the region for millennia, including representations of the transformer figures, spirit helpers, and vision quest imagery that are characteristic of plateau cultural traditions across a wide area. The Nlaka'pamux have detailed oral traditions associated with specific rock art sites, and in many cases those traditions provide a rich interpretive context for the images that archaeology alone could not supply. This is the proper and primary framework within which BC rock art should be understood, and researchers who have worked most carefully in the region have consistently emphasized the importance of indigenous interpretive knowledge in any serious analysis of the sites. But within the broader rock art landscape of the BC interior, there are individual sites and specific image types that have attracted questions from researchers. Working at the intersection of rock art studies and the broader question of pre-Columbian contact. Some of these questions have focused on geometric symbol types, particularly cross in circle motifs, concentric circle forms, and spiral configurations that appear both in BC rock art and in Old World traditions in ways that some researchers have proposed reflect a common origin or a history of cultural contact rather than independent invention. These comparisons are methodologically tricky because geometric forms have a limited range of possible variations, and the same basic shapes appearing in different cultures separated by wide distances, may reflect nothing more than the common cognitive tendencies of human beings who make marks on stone. More specific and more interesting are the comparisons that have been drawn between certain figurative images in BC rock art and specific representational traditions from Old World cultures. Certain figures at sites in the Okanagan region have been compared to Bronze Age rock art traditions from Scandinavia and the Alpine region of Europe, with specific reference to the posture, proportions, and equipment of the human figures depicted. These comparisons have been made by researchers who are themselves skeptical of simple diffusionist explanations and who are careful to note the limitations of iconographic comparison as a method. But they have noted that the similarities in some cases go beyond what can be comfortably attributed to coincidence. The broader significance of BC interior rock art for the question of Canadian prehistory lies not only in the specific questions about individual images, but in what the sheer volume and density of the rock art tradition tells us about the depth of human presence and cultural development in the region. The BC interior was not a marginal or peripheral landscape in prehistoric times. It was a well-populated, culturally sophisticated, and long inhabited environment in which complex traditions of visual communication, spiritual practice, and landscape marking developed over thousands of years. The people who made these marks were not simple or primitive. They were participants in rich intellectual and spiritual traditions whose full complexity we are only beginning to appreciate. The dry climate of the BC interior has been relatively favorable for the preservation of rock art, particularly petroglyphs incised into basalt and other hard stone. Sites that are sheltered from direct precipitation can preserve images for extraordinarily long periods. The oldest rock art sites in the region have not been definitively dated, because rock surfaces themselves do not yield radiocarbon dates, and the association of organic materials with specific images is rarely straightforward. Some of the oldest appearing images, those with the deepest patination and the most eroded surfaces, may be considerably older than the several thousand-year time frame that is commonly cited as the outer limit of the regional tradition. The honest answer is that the age of the oldest BC interior rock art is not known. What is known is that when you stand before these images on a still morning, with the pine-scented dry air of the interior plateau around you and the sound of a river somewhere below, the presence of human intentionality in the carved lines is unmistakable. Someone stood here, in this specific spot, and decided that this image needed to exist. Whatever tradition they were working in, whatever meaning they were encoding, whatever story they were beginning or continuing, the act of making was a serious one. These are not idle scratchings. They are records of something that mattered, left by people who expected them to last. In the valleys and uplands of southern Ontario, in the country between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and north toward the Canadian Shield, ancient peoples built earthworks on a scale and with a complexity that is not widely acknowledged in the popular account of pre-contact history in this part of Canada. The earthworks of southern Ontario, some of them enclosures of considerable size, others burial mounds or platform structures, represent a tradition of monumental construction that connects the region to the broader Hopewell and woodland traditions of the eastern North American interior, while also exhibiting local characteristics that reflect the specific cultural history of the peoples who built them. The tradition of earthwork construction in Ontario reached its most elaborate expression in the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era during the period archaeologists call Middle Woodland. Communities along the Thames River, the Grand River, and other southern Ontario watersheds built conical burial mounds, sometimes grouped in clusters, that served as mortuary monuments and as focal points for ceremonial activity across wide communities. These mounds are not dramatic in the way that the great Mississippian mounds of the American South are dramatic, but they are substantial and they are numerous, and the traditions that produce them reflect a level of social organization and ceremonial investment that contradicts any notion of Southern Ontario's pre-contact peoples as simple or uncomplicated. The mounds contain burials of considerable sophistication. Artifacts recovered from Southern Ontario. Woodland burial contexts include objects made from materials originating far outside the region. Copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from sources in the American West, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast. These materials arrived in Southern Ontario through the vast exchange networks of the Hopewell tradition, a pan-continental phenomenon in which goods, ideas, and probably people moved across enormous distances through chains of reciprocal exchange. The presence of Gulf Coast shells in an Ontario burial mound represents not a single long-distance journey, but the cumulative effect of many shorter exchanges, each passing objects a little further along networks that ultimately connected the Great Lakes to the ocean shores in multiple directions. Much of this earthwork heritage in Southern Ontario has been destroyed. The agricultural transformation of the region over the past 2 centuries has been thorough and largely irreversible. Plowing, drainage, and development have eliminated most of the mounds and earthworks that once marked the landscape, leaving only scattered archaeological records and a handful of surviving features in places that escaped cultivation. The loss is not merely archaeological. It is a loss of visible landscape heritage, of physical markers that connected living communities to the long human history of the places they inhabit. Some of the surviving earthworks are more enigmatic than the mortuary mounds. In certain parts of Southern Ontario, large enclosures defined by ditches or low embankments have been documented, sometimes enclosing substantial areas and in some cases exhibiting orientations that align with astronomical phenomena in ways similar to the medicine wheels of the prairies. The function of these enclosures is not agreed upon by researchers. Some appear to be ceremonial gathering places. Others may have served defensive purposes. Others defy easy categorization, their scale and their architectural features inconsistent with any single obvious functional explanation. The earthwork tradition of Southern Ontario is part of a broader story about the cultural complexity of the Great Lakes region. In the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era, a story that is more richly documented in the American Midwest than in Canada, but that extended north into Ontario with as much vigor and sophistication as it did anywhere in its range. The peoples of this tradition were not living simple lives on the margins of a more developed world to the south. They were participants in a continental cultural network, contributing to and drawing from traditions of ceremony, exchange, and monument building that constituted one of the most dynamic periods in the pre-contact history of the Americas. In the vast boreal wilderness of northern Canada, stretching from the Labrador coast westward through Quebec and Ontario and into the Precambrian heart of the country, there are lakes whose shores have been sacred places in Indigenous traditions for as long as those traditions extend. Among these, Lake Nipigon in northern Ontario occupies a particularly complex place in both the archaeological record and in the oral traditions of the ancient Anishinaabe people. The largest lake lying entirely within Ontario, Nipigon sits on the northern edge of Lake Superior's drainage basin, surrounded by shield country of great age and geological complexity. Its shores and the river systems feeding it have been inhabited for thousands of years, and the landscape holds evidence of human activity spanning the full range of post-glacial time in this region. But what has drawn certain researchers to Lake Nipigon beyond its documented archaeological record is its proximity to the Beardmore Relics find site and its place in a broader pattern of reported anomalies in northern Ontario that suggest the region may have been a destination or a route for travelers whose presence the standard historical record does not acknowledge. The rivers flowing south from the Nipigon Basin into Lake Superior trace routes that could be followed north from the Great Lakes into the boreal interior, routes that were well known to the fur trade era. Canoemen who followed them centuries after whatever earlier travelers may have used them. The oral traditions of the Anishinaabe people who have lived around Lake Nipigon for generations speak of encounters with beings and peoples that exist in a zone between the mundane and the mythological. Among these traditions are accounts of visitors who came from beyond the known world and left marks in the landscape. Modified stones, changed features of shoreline, unusual objects that eventually passed into the keeping of particular families or were lost to time. How these traditions should be interpreted, whether as literal historical memory or as mythological narrative or as some combination of the two, is a question that cannot be answered from outside the community and its knowledge systems. But the general principle that oral traditions encode genuine historical memory has been demonstrated in numerous other contexts around the world, and the Nipigon traditions deserve to be considered in that light rather than dismissed as purely mythological. The broader question of what Northern Ontario's waterway networks might have meant to pre-Columbian travelers, if such travelers existed, is worth holding open. The canoe routes of the Canadian Shield connect the Great Lakes to Hudson Bay in one direction and to the upper St. Lawrence watershed in another. These routes have been in use since the first post-glacial populations colonized the Shield, and their strategic significance for movement across the continent is considerable. Any group of people arriving on the Atlantic coast and wishing to move into the interior of the continent would, if they possessed canoe technology, have found these waterways precisely the kind of passage their intentions required. The Shield country wouldn't have been a barrier to movement. It would have been a highway. The archaeology of the Northern Ontario waterway system is incompletely known. Survey coverage is sparse, dictated by the logistical difficulties of working in remote boreal terrain and the cultural resource management frameworks that drive much archaeological survey work tend to focus on areas of planned development rather than on the vast stretches of undisturbed wilderness that still characterize much of the north. What systematic surveys have been conducted in the region have consistently found evidence of continuous indigenous occupation stretching back to the earliest post-glacial period, with a complexity and a density of sites that underline the long and deep human significance of this landscape. What those surveys have not done is look specifically for the kind of non-indigenous material presence that the various anomalies in the regional record suggest might be worth searching for. The rock faces along the waterways of northern Ontario carry pictographs in significant numbers, images applied in red ochre to cliff faces above the waterline at locations that mark important passages, dangerous rapids, significant confluences, and places of spiritual power. These images were made by the Anishinaabe and their ancestors across a span of many centuries, and they communicate in a visual language that researchers are still learning to read with any confidence. Some of the images record specific events: canoe parties, encounters with animals or spirit beings, the passage of notable individuals or groups. Others are more abstract, marking the spiritual character of a location in a way that would have been understood immediately by any knowledgeable traveler of the waterway, but that is less legible to an outsider. Among the pictograph sites of northern Ontario, several have been noted by researchers for containing image types that do not fit neatly into the established Anishinaabe visual tradition. These include geometric forms of unusual regularity, depictions of vessel types that some researchers have compared to Old World boat forms, and in at least one case, a series of marks on a cliff face that were compared tentatively and with appropriate caution to a European script tradition. These comparisons have not been developed into formal research programs, partly because of the methodological difficulty of distinguishing genuine anomalies from misidentified or misunderstood elements of indigenous visual conventions, and partly because the institutional climate in Canadian archaeology has not been particularly receptive to investigations along these lines. What would be needed to make genuine progress on these questions is not more speculation, but more and better data, more comprehensive survey of the Northern Ontario waterway systems, more rigorous documentation of the anomalous features that have been observed, more systematic application of the analytical tools that can distinguish natural from artificial markings and that can characterize the age and origin of rock, art, and other surface features. The technology to do this work exists. The data management frameworks to organize and analyze what is found exists. What has been lacking is the institutional will and the financial resources to conduct the work at the scale the question requires. In the meantime, the lakes and rivers of Northern Ontario carry their secrets in the same patient stillness they have always maintained. The pictographs fade slowly on the cliff faces above the waterlines, their red ochre darkening and wearing in the decades since they were last documented. The Shield Country holds its complex geology and its sparse archaeological record in the deep quiet of the boreal forest, undisturbed in most of its extent by the questions that a more fully surveyed landscape might begin to answer. There is something almost appropriate about this, a landscape that has always held its own counsel, that has been a place of passage and of dwelling for thousands of years without yielding a simple story, continuing to withhold the complete account even as the tools for reading it slowly improve. Across the full sweep of the evidence examined in this long journey through Canada's ancient mysteries, certain themes emerge with enough consistency to be worth naming. One is the theme of institutional resistance, the repeated pattern in which discoveries that do not fit the standard model are met not with open investigation, but with marginalization, dismissal, and in some cases the professional destruction of the researchers who made them. Thomas Lee at Shigyanda, Jacques Cinq-Mars at Bluefish Caves, and others working at similarly anomalous sites experienced a version of the same response to their findings. The pattern is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling, the natural tendency of any established intellectual framework to protect itself from revision. The second theme is the sheer scale of what remains unknown. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and its archaeological survey coverage is, by global standards, remarkably thin. The vast boreal forest of the north, the mountain systems of the west, the river networks of the Shield, the continental shelf beneath the Pacific and the Atlantic. These are all environments in which the full story of human presence has not been told, and in many cases has barely been approached. The known sites, the documented anomalies, the unsolved mysteries surveyed in this video are not the full inventory of what exists. They are the visible fraction of a much larger body of evidence that has never been systematically examined. The third theme is the depth of indigenous knowledge about these landscapes and their history. This theme runs beneath all the others, and in many ways is more important than any of them. The oral traditions of Canada's First Nations peoples are not decoration on the margins of the archaeological record. They are a form of evidence in their own right, often more precisely targeted at specific places and specific events than the physical record alone can be. The consistent theme in those traditions of a very long and very deep human relationship with specific Canadian landscapes, a relationship extending back to times that Western scientific frameworks are only now beginning to document, is not a coincidence. It reflects the actual history of human presence in this country, a history that is older, richer, and more complex than any single framework has yet been able to contain. The Mi'kmaq traditions of the Atlantic coast, the Anishinaabe traditions of the Shield Country, the oral histories of the prairie nations that speak of the medicine wheels as ancient beyond counting. These are not mythology in the dismissive sense of that word. They are archives. They are records maintained through extraordinary collective effort across spans of time that exceed any written tradition on earth, and they deserve to be treated with the same analytical seriousness that is given to any other form of historical evidence. The dialogue between the archaeological record and the oral traditions is one of the most productive frontiers in the study of Canadian prehistory, and it is a dialogue that is still only in its early stages. The oral traditions of Canada's First Nations peoples are not decoration on the margins of the archaeological record. They are a form of evidence in their own right, often more precisely targeted at specific places and events than the physical record alone can be. The consistent theme in those traditions of a very long and very deep human relationship with specific Canadian landscapes, a relationship extending back to times that Western scientific frameworks are only now beginning to document, is not a coincidence. It reflects the actual history of human presence in this country, a history that is older, richer, and more complex than any single framework has yet been able to contain. The fourth theme, and perhaps the most important one for anyone listening to this account in the quiet of the night, is that the story is ongoing. These are not closed questions. The Alpena Amberley Ridge structures await further investigation. The Cheguenda site awaits the comprehensive analysis it was never given. The continental shelf off the BC coast awaits systematic survey. The standing stones of Quebec await rigorous documentation. The Northern Ontario waterway systems await the kind of comprehensive archaeological survey that only sustained investment can produce. The mysteries are real. The evidence is real, and the work of understanding what that evidence means has barely begun. There is one more place worth lingering over before this account reaches its quiet end, a place that sits on the border between the documented and the speculative in a way that is characteristic of so many of the sites examined throughout this journey. The Kejimkujik National Park in the interior of Nova Scotia protects, among its many natural features, the most significant concentration of Mi'kmaq petroglyphs in Atlantic Canada. The images, incised into the smooth slate of the lake shores within the park, number in the hundreds and span a wide range of subjects: human figures, animals, celestial symbols, and scenes that appear to depict events of various kinds. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia have maintained a living relationship with these images and the traditions they represent, and the petroglyphs are among the most carefully protected and respectfully interpreted rock art sites in the country. What makes Kejimkujik relevant to the broader question of Canadian ancient mysteries is not the well-documented Mi'kmaq rock art tradition, which is genuine, rich, and deserving of attention in its own right, but the context in which that tradition sits. The Mi'kmaq are among the indigenous peoples of Atlantic Canada, whose linguistic and genetic heritage has been the subject of the research into possible pre-Columbian contact discussed earlier in this account. They are a maritime people with a deep and sophisticated tradition of coastal navigation, and their territory encompasses the same Atlantic shoreline that would have been the natural landfall for anyone crossing the ocean from the east. Whatever did or did not happen on that coast in the millennia before European colonization, the Mi'kmaq and their ancestors were the people who were there. The Mi'kmaq oral traditions themselves, as recorded and analyzed by researchers over the past century and a half, contain elements that some scholars have argued reflect the memory of contact with peoples from across the water in a pre-Columbian context. The traditions speak of culture heroes and transformers who arrived or departed by sea, of encounters with beings of unusual appearance, of gifts and teachings that came from beyond the known world. These traditions are not presented as history in the Western sense, as linear narratives of datable events, but as mythological accounts of the formation of the present world from interactions between different kinds of beings. Reading historical content from such traditions is methodologically complex, and the risk of projecting modern interpretive categories onto ancient narrative forms is real. But the traditions exist, they have been maintained with considerable care, and they deserve to be treated as potentially encoding something real about the long history of the coast on which they were formed. The slate of the Kejimkujik lakeshores, smooth and gray and responsive to careful incision, holds images that span multiple centuries of Mi'kmaq visual tradition. Some of the most recent images, dating to the post-contact period, depict European ships and figures in European dress, unmistakable records of the historical encounter that transformed the world of the Atlantic coast peoples forever. These images sit alongside older ones, made in the same medium by ancestors who had not yet seen those ships. The contrast between the two kinds of images, the familiar and the utterly new, is visible in the stone in a way that is quietly moving. The people who made the images of European ships were the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of people who had never imagined what a European ship looked like. And yet they adapted their tradition to record the new reality with the same deliberate attention they brought to everything else they marked in stone. The deeper images, those made before the European arrival, speak in a visual language that researchers are still learning to read with confidence. They record aspects of a world that no longer fully exists, a world of ceremonies and migrations and animal relationships and spiritual encounters that the violence of colonization disrupted in ways that are still being reckoned with. The petroglyphs of Kejimkujik are not simply ancient curiosities. They are part of a living tradition connected to communities that still exist and that still carry knowledge of what these images mean and why they were made. That living connection is itself a kind of extraordinary persistence, a thread running from the people who first marked these lakeshores to the people who today maintain the relationship with those marks across the gulf of everything that has happened in between. For anyone approaching Canada's ancient mysteries from outside the indigenous communities whose traditions and territories are involved, the most important thing to understand is that these mysteries are not abstract puzzles to be solved from a comfortable distance. They are questions embedded in landscapes that belong to living peoples, and the answers to those questions, when they come, will need to be built in relationship with those peoples and their knowledge systems rather than imposed over them. The archaeological record and the oral tradition are not competing sources of information. They are complementary ones, and the combination of both, approached with mutual respect and genuine collaboration, offers the best possible foundation for understanding what this land has to tell. The questions remain open. The landscape remains patient. Somewhere beneath the cold, clear water of a shield lake, somewhere in the sediment of a prairie river, somewhere in a limestone cave in the boreal north, the next piece of evidence is waiting to be found. The night is quiet now, and the country lies dark from coast to coast. The limestone at Peterborough holds its 900 carvings in the dark, visited only by the sound of the underground stream moving far below. The Majorville cairn sits on its rise above the Bow River, its spokestones resting in the dark of the Alberta prairie, pointed toward stars that have not changed their paths since the day they were first aligned with. The floors of the Great Lakes rest in cold silence 40 meters down, holding whatever they hold in the same stillness they have held it for 10,000 years. The copper mines of Lake Superior's northern shore are quiet, their ancient pits filled in with centuries of forest floor, the hammerstones that broke the rock loose scattered and settled into the earth from which they came. In northern Ontario, the Beardmore relics sit in museum storage, unanswered, their iron slowly oxidizing in controlled conditions, their provenance still disputed, their story still unresolved. On the southern shore of Nova Scotia, the rock faces where someone may once have carved Ogham. Letters face the Atlantic, weathered and patient, and open to interpretation by whoever comes to them next with fresh eyes and the willingness to look carefully. On Manitoulin Island, the pale limestone outcrops of the Shagenda shore catch whatever light the sky provides above Lake Huron, as they have caught the light of stars for longer than any accepted record of human presence in this country extends. In the boreal north, the lakes and rivers of the Shield reflect whatever moon is up tonight, their surfaces dark and still, their depths holding the organic record of 10,000 years of forest and water and the creatures that move through both. The pictographs on the cliff faces above the waterlines fade slowly in the weather, their ochre darkening by fractions across the years, recording in their slow disappearance the same passage of time that they were made to mark. The medicine wheels of the prairies stand open to the sky as they have always stood, their stone alignments unchanged by the centuries, their solstice orientations as precise in this year as they were in the year they were built, and in every year between. Canada is an old country, not old in the way its institutions are old, or old in the way its national story is told. Old in the way that geological time is old, and in the way that human determination is old. The determination of people to be somewhere, to mark it, to understand it, to leave some sign that they were there and that it mattered. Those signs exist across this vast and quiet land, in the stone and the water and the earth. They are waiting in the cold and the dark for the questions that will one day bring them fully into the light. And in the meantime, they are simply here, as they have been for a very long time, patient and permanent and profoundly unexplained. Rest now, let it go, sleep well.